Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Adam Interviews, where we are talking to folks doing things of note in our community. And our guest today certainly fits that bill. We've got with us Jamie Druckman with U of R, political scientist over there. Thank you so much, Jamie, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I got to know Jamie and talk with him at a Jewish book festival recently. And while we were talking, I was just joking with him that I felt like we were just having a conversation in a living room, and then we look out, oh, there's an audience there. I suppose we should stay professional. But one of the things that Jamie brings to the table is data to places that don't normally have it. And that's kind of the impression that I get. And that can be refreshing in a sense, because sometimes we talk about how we come to conclusions and we don't actually have numbers to back it up or whatnot. And Jamie has a book out right now. It's his latest one called Partisan Hostility and American Democracy, Explaining Political Division and When They Matter. I'm glad you were able to take on such a light topic.
Yes,
in such difficult times.
Yeah. It's actually interesting when I first started in this profession as a political scientist at around the late 1990s. One of the big concerns amongst political scientists were that the parties were not strong enough, that they weren't providing responsible platforms, and we needed to strengthen the parties. So you had a lot of work kind of bemoaning the lack of strong parties, and so in not many years you kind of have the opposite concern. So it has been quite an evolution in the 21st century.
And you've been tracking it through surveys and whatnot, and looking at how people answer questions when it comes to their ideology, their political affiliation. And the one takeaway that I got is how much emotion plays into it. And I don't think that's been fully explored. If you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, so we can think about kind of partisanship in various different ways. And historically, we might think about it as people have some kind of an ideological belief system, and they attach themselves to a particular party, and they might update if the policies change. They might switch parties. And for a long time, through much of the 20th century, that was really based around economic divides, right? So you kind of had labor versus business, and that divided the parties, and we kind of classify people based on their beliefs on those things. What we kind of saw emerging in the 21st century particularly was people started to form more of an emotional attachment, kind of an identity attachment to the parties. And so they weren't necessarily updating as frequently to think about, well, is this party matching a particular ideology that I have? But rather became kind of enmeshed in their identities as people. So we have different identities in terms of our various demographics or our religions, and partisanship kind of took on that kind of sense for people. And the challenge then is when people have very strong feelings about an identity, they're not likely to change. They're less likely to look at information objectively. They're more likely to view this in kind of us versus them terms. And so it becomes problematic in terms of how we might function as a society and in a democracy. And so it raises these questions of why did that happen? What are the consequences of that? And so on and so forth.
You rose the very questions I was about to ask. Why did that happen?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of dynamics that occurred in the 21st century. We can think about them in a few buckets. One bucket is just the amount of change that elites brought amongst themselves. So elites, when I say elites, I'm thinking of members of Congress or party leaders along those lines. And they ideologically polarized over time. So you can think of this starting, there's a longer history to it, but the demarcation is really probably the 1990s, Newt Gingrich. And we started to see a divide amongst the two parties, where the Republican Party started to shift more to the right, the Democratic Party shifted more to the left. A little bit more on the Republican Party, we're moving more quickly. And so that was providing different cues to voters insofar as the parties were differentiating themselves. And so you started to attach yourself to one party or another, and you were more distant from people from the other party. So that's one dynamic that was going on. Another dynamic was, of course, the transformation of media. And so, right, if we go back in time, even to the end of the 20th century, but particularly if you go back to the 1980s, you saw, there were mainstream media, there were some networks that everybody was getting their news from. And we started to see that fall apart with the rise of cable, and then, of course, with the internet and social media. So we're living in very different information environments now. And what that consequence of that is that we're coming at things from very different perspectives and different factual beliefs even. And so that separates partisans insofar as they don't know what the other person is thinking. They have a very different point of reference. And so it becomes very difficult to kind of see the other side, so to speak. And so that's definitely another dynamic. A third dynamic that I'd put in there is just the extent of demographic change that has occurred in the 21st century. And we can kind of look at that in a variety of trends. One trend, of course, is the idea that the white population will no longer projected to not be a majority of the population by around the 1940s or the 1950s. And so that kind of...
what is it, the 2040s, right?
Oh, did I say 19? Yes. Yeah, 2042, 2048. Yeah. 20, yes.
That's okay. My son says that I was born in the 1900s. So
yes. Well, yeah, thank you for correcting
of course.
it. Yeah. So that's one trend. Another trend is secularization that was occurring. So for kind of a similar projection a little bit later is that Christians may no longer be a majority in the country by around 2050, 2060. And then we saw, not a demographic trend as much, but a bit of a change in power. And women were gaining more political power. So you're still a clear minority in most governing bodies, but you see them increasing in size. And so you kind of have these trends going on, and at the same time, you have these punctuated events in society, right? So if we think of demographic trends in terms of race, you also then had the election of Barack Obama. You had kind of increased in immigration, and that creates a sense of threat, and it highlights the salience of race, and people start to think about which party do they affiliate with in racial terms. And so you kind of you see this rise in racialization of different public policies and divide between the parties that we might not have seen since the civil rights movement era. And so that's one dynamic. You kind of see similar dynamics going on with gender, especially the Me Too movement takes on a life of its own. And so you start to see partisans sorting based on gender, and you see it on religiosity as well, right? Secular individuals were moving towards the Democrats, more religious individuals were moving towards the Republicans. And so you put all those three different dynamics together where you have the elites, the media, demographic trends, and people start to view partisanship as a mega identity of sorts, right? It envelops lots of their other identities. So in the past, you might have your gender identity, your racial identity, your religion, and that might overlap or cut against the typical person in your political party. But when everybody in the political party starts to share the same attitudes and the same identities, then partisanship becomes something that really it captures all of who you are, and the other party looks at captures all of who you're not, and so it becomes a much more tense division between these two parties. And then there's another thing going on kind of in the background, which is a division I mentioned earlier that if you go back in time, the really divide between the parties was on the economic dimension, and that's really evolved over time since the 1970s. What you've seen is those divides have remained, although they're a bit in flux at the moment. But what you've seen is the rise of a different type of cleavage, and this is really a cleavage based on knowledge-based institutions. And this became particularly exacerbated during COVID, but it preceded COVID. Somewhere in the 2000s or the 2010s, you start to see a sorting of partisans. And so you had the two parties around 2000. If you go back and you look at data trends from around 2000, you ask people how much they trust educational institutions or how much they trust medical institutions or how much they trust science. There was some divide, but not that much divide. In fact, when it comes to science, they were pretty much at the same exact place. But what you saw then over the last 25 years, 26 years, is that you see this divide emerging where Democrats started to become very supportive. They moved more and more trustworthy towards science and medicine and education, and Republicans moved in the opposite direction. So in that sense, it's a bit of a reconfiguring of the divides between the parties. So everything I spoke about up until this moment is really more about identity, but there's also this redivision in ideology and what are the beliefs that divide the parties. And again, that became very clear during COVID, where Democrats became even more trusting of science, and I think some would say too trusting of science, and Republicans moved in the opposite directions. And so you saw these pretty large spikes in both directions during COVID. And so that's reconfigured the issue space, so to speak, that we might think about the parties congregating.
And I think this is a good point here, and what you're making is that partisanship has been part of the American landscape since Hamilton and Jefferson, right? I mean, we've had bitter feuds when it comes to power struggles within a two-party system. We've seen it leading up to the Civil War, after the Civil War, FDR saw it, and huge presidential elections with Kennedy and Nixon and all that. So partisanship has been there, but you're saying that how people identify with a party has changed over time. It's not that conflict within partisanship is new. It's that how people view themselves within political parties is new. Is that a correct?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great characterization. The only caveat that I'd add
Yeah,
to that
please.
is what we know since post World War II. We don't have a great. We have historians have done a great job at understanding what was going on prior to that, particularly around the Civil War period. And we do know there was a lot of partisan violence, obviously, at that point in time. So in some sense, a lot of what we think we know about politics is really relative to what might be a very unique period in American history. Because if we look at voting in Congress, for example, it was really quite divided prior to World War II. Then it became much less divided post-World War II. And then what I spoke about before is the elites polarizing starting around in the 1990s or so. That really was relative to what they looked like in the post-World War II setting. So in a sense, I think your characterization is accurate. We don't have a great sense of the whole history, at least in the acute sense of what I'm speaking about. Like, we don't know how people thought about themselves and their parties if we go back to the Civil War era. There's reason to think that it was fairly effective and fairly intense, given the violence that was going on at the time. The difference, though, again, I'm not a historian, but my sense is, to the extent that that period provides us any insight, it's hard to carry that over because the context in which we're living is so dramatically different in terms of the media environment, the demographic environment, and it's just a very different country, and the amount of kind of resources put into government, the amount to which government shapes our lives. It's just such a different situation that even if the sense of partisanship was the same at that point in time, parties and government was just such a smaller factor in people's lives. And so in that sense, even if there was a historical precedent for some of these feelings, that probably doesn't translate to what we're facing at this moment in time.
I think your work helps to potentially explain the question that a lot of people have had over the last week or so, which is how can two sets of people look at the shooting of Renee Good in Minneapolis and see two different scenarios?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that this increase in the salience of partisan identity does is it leads people to reason in a way that is not necessarily as logical as we might like, right? They arrive at a conclusion and they rationalize what their conclusion is. And so in that sense, they saw there was a murder, then they wanted to arrive at an explanation for what they were going to already think. And so, right, if you're on the right, if you're Trump, you're going to think, well, this had to be, the ICE person protecting themselves and being attacked. And if you're on the other side, then you're going to think the opposite. And so you interpret things differently, which is why, it's very important. And there's an important place in coming back to kind of what can we think about ways to bridge some of these things for media to play a role there, right? I think media stepped in there. I think the New York Times offered a very thoughtful kind of frame by frame, I think millisecond by millisecond practically kind of analysis of what was going on there. And so I think a lot of people were at the conclusions before they had the analysis of that. And so you need entities to do those kinds of more, what you might think of as more objective analyses of events that are going on.
Yeah, it's tough though, because often those in power try to label even objective, especially objective sources as working again, as having an agenda. Because I think then that, and listen, both folks on the left and right do it throughout different countries and different points of history, because if someone is truly trying to be objective and focus on the truth, it might not fit with the agenda of the person in power, so it behooves them to mischaracterize that outlet. I think that's, and I think that we're seeing that quite a bit.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the most concerning things to me is what is happening with media and news in particular, and the threat that they might feel if they report in a specific way, that they might feel threatened by the administration, right? And I think there was, pretty widely discussed remark, I think just last week, about Trump did a CBS interview, and the response was, if you edit that interview, we're going to sue you. And that kind of intimidation is really problematic. Not just, it should be problematic to everybody, because ideally we want to see information that's in an objective manner. And so you don't want political forces shaping what media can or can't do. So that's concerning. And it comes at a period in time where we're already losing local media at such a rapid pace, particularly local newspapers, that there's a huge void that needs to be filled. And so filling it with what might even be more uncertain media adds to the worry about that. And I think one of the things I mentioned media, and I focused a lot on social media as one of the things that precipitated the state that we find ourselves in now in terms of polarization. But another is the decline of local media, which used to serve to cut across parties, right? People would form local identities more likely. The decline of local civic institutions, the decline of local and state parties. Those things, used to play a role to bridge some of the divides between parties. Because if you lived in a certain location, those were institutions that made people from different sides come together and address things. And as those institutions have decayed a little bit, that's no longer having that force. Things are, put more succinctly, is politics have nationalized, partisanship has nationalized.
I'm glad you mentioned the civic institution, because my take, not having looked at the data as closely as you have, is that the fewer times we join Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, or the fewer people who go to Rotary or what have you, or even church, because people don't agree on everything when they go to church or temple or the mosque. And I think that if the less we congregate, the less we see each other and recognize that the differences are down here and the similarities are up here.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And the extent to which virtual interactions can replace that seems to be not a lot. I think that's just coming. People are just coming to appreciate that. I think one of the technological challenges was as internet and social media were perfusing through the country, there was concern, and there was often reference to, well, we had radio, we had television, everybody was panicked about those things, and look, it didn't turn out so horribly. Important difference, though, is the rate of perfusion was so vast in terms of the internet and social media. It replaced so much so quickly that we don't have a great sense of the impact yet, right? There's still ongoing, pretty vicious debates about the impact of social media on well-being. And I think there's moving towards a consensus, but there's not a consensus on that at all. And that's an awfully large problem, and it's a problem that you'd think government would want to be thinking about. And some governments are thinking about that. Speaking of the United States, obviously, Australia has banned social media for people under 16, but not in a bipartisan sense. So it's at the state level somewhat more in a bipartisan sense, but at the federal level not so much. And so that's something, the regulation of media and kind of how that plays into things as media moves so quickly. That's something that's been a challenge, I think.
And I think that kind of gets to where I was hoping the conversation would go, is proposing solutions, because clearly, I'll state the obvious if our viewers haven't taken it away, is there's concern in your book over the trend. I mean, hence the word hostility built in there. So where do we go from here that can possibly help to, as you noted at the top of this conversation, bridge the divide?
Yeah, I think it's a challenge. I think there are two routes that people tend to speak about. One is kind of a more behavioral route, where you might have interventions that help people think about the other side, take the perspective of the other side. There's lots of organizations that are pushing those types of interventions. They're helpful. The challenge is how you scale those up and how you get people access to those. And so, for example, there are organizations that will have people come together from different parties and have a meal together. Or there are organizations that will ask people to think more thoughtfully about the perspective of the other side, or learn more about what the other side thinks. The problem is, how do you get people to actually do those things? That leads to a second bucket of things that one could pursue, which are more structural reforms. And those are very difficult because it's hard to change institutions and structures, particularly when you have divided partisans. They can't come to an agreement on how we should change those structures, right? And in fact, what we've seen is the opposite in terms of the gerrymandering race that we've seen going on. Is the opposite of what you might want in terms of changing those structures. And so I think the one solution that's realistic is to try to rebuild, or not rebuild, but build stronger local institutions. I think, as I got at before, those have really decayed. I think those are things that there is some reason that people in different locales would want those to be stronger. I think when you think about local media, I mean, there's a market question, but I think in terms of kind of civic capacity, that would be a helpful endeavor if you can find a cost-effective way to do that. and civic organizations, and kind of ask the question of why are civic organizations not as encompassing in people's lives as they once were, and think about that. And because those are moments where people do come together and come together in person, and that's where you learn about other perspectives. And so there's that question of how do we build those more strongly. And I think that raises a host of not only political and institutional questions, but sociological questions of why people are not socializing as much. What are the challenges? Why are kids not going to as many activities, and along those lines? And so I think that's where solutions might lie. And then there's this is not a solution, but the trajectory of what the country will look like. It will depend on how the parties evolve, and the parties. I think it's fair to say both parties are in a little bit of crisis right now. And so what they will look like in 5 years is very hard to predict. I think the parties have separated along the lines that I spoke before in terms of knowledge-based institutions or not. And on the right, you have more of an embrace of religion, military, what you might call norming institutions. You also see the emergence, going back to the demographic trends that I pointed out before. You have the emergence of kind of hierarchical attitudes now separates the parties quite a bit. So that's not necessarily new, but it's become a little bit more accentuated. Republicans tend to embrace hierarchical organization of society, traditional organizations of society, whereas Democrats less and less so. Again, that's not new, but it's become a little bit more accentuated. What is a little bit new, so if we ask about, if you want to call it a remaking of the Republican Party in some sense, which I think is a fair thing to say, I don't think the Republican Party looks much like it did in 2012. It's not the hierarchical part, but there's a second component is a grievance part. And grievance, we can think of grievance as kind of the expression of victimhood, the expression of conspiratorial thinking at times, the expression of blame. And that has a long history, of course, grievance. Historically, though, that is mostly for groups that have been clearly institutional, disenfranchised, kind of lower on status hierarchies. And what happened really is kind of in the 21st century is you've seen grievance taken up from advantaged groups and disadvantaged groups. So you have competing victimhood claims, competing grievance claims. And I think that explains the kind of transformation of the Republican Party into what you might think of as a populist party, where, I'm going to attack government, I'm going to undo government, because I'm aggrieved and I need to address it in some way. And so I think that intersection of grievance and hierarchy explains, I think, where the Republican Party sits right now. And I don't know how that's, given the extent to which changes are being made and how those will play out, you could see it going in one of two directions at the very least, right? One direction it continues, which is, fairly an autocratic direction as it sits right now, or there's pushback against it and it kind of goes back to being a more ideologically conservative party. And on the left, I think you have similar tensions, just not as dramatic tensions, right? You see there was clearly a tension between progressive Democrats and more established moderate Democrats. You can kind of paint similar parameters around that in terms of grievance and where you're sitting. It's just that I think the split is not as extreme in the consequences of those splits. And the Democratic Party has a history of figuring out how to bring groups together, right? They're a party that's always been based on groups, so this is not new to them. Whereas the Republican Party has always been more of an ideological party, where you fall in line more quickly. And so it's a little bit different for the Republican Party when we're talking about different group claims versus the Democratic Party.
I think you're right. There is trouble within both. The Republican Party now, really, you have the small c conservatives and the Tea Party, and neither can live without each other power-wise right now. They need each other to win on the national level. And then, of course, you have that conventional, decades-long split in the Democratic Party between the center-left and the progressive. So we'll see what happens. I saw an article the other day that said more people are registering or even self-labeling themselves as independent. Yeah. I know what I'm about to say is going to sound so poli-sci 101, but I mean, could a third party, a strong third party led by a charismatic person who has the wherewithal to actually pull something like this off, could this throw everything that we're talking about up in the air, because suddenly you wouldn't have this polarized 1v1 perspective where there might be a third, and it might be hard for a political party then to incorporate someone's complete identity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think you could. I think that both parties have moved in a direction that the median voter does not want them to move. And so that all is a sign that these parties need to adjust themselves, or there's an opening for somebody else to emerge. Institutionally, it's difficult. You're never going to have a three-party system at the national level in this country, or even the state or local level in an election system where you're electing one person in a given constituency. What you could imagine, though, is the emergence of some kind of a cross-partisan coalition. I think that got a little conversation prior to 2024 with Liz Cheney partner with a Democrat and run for office. You could imagine that emerging and being quite alluring to voters. The challenge is just the institutional heft of that, right? You don't have decades, hundreds of years of kind of institutional kind of organization resources. So I think it's possible. I think it's difficult. So I would probably think more about which way, with these internal struggles within the party, which way are they going to end up going? Are they going to move towards what you would see as an independent ticket, or are they going to keep going to the extreme? And you might see the emergence of an independent ticket along the lines that you're discussing, that you brought up, and that would push the parties to moderate themselves a little bit as well. So you could see the emergence of that. If it becomes a new party, that's very hard to do in a modern era. We haven't seen a lot of new parties in the U.S. and particularly in modern times. I think in part because it's institutionally so difficult.
Yeah, fair point. What are you working on now?
A lot of stuff on trust. So thinking about the trends that I was speaking about before, and you can kind of see those trends across different institutions, and then how does that play out not only at the individual on the national level, but also at the state level, and trying to understand particularly what went on during COVID. And COVID was such a, when COVID first hit, you had a fair number of scholars who studied polarization thinking, well, COVID is going to be this unifying moment. It's going to be a moment where it'll bring all of us together, kind of like a 9/11 moment where you did see a depolarization after 9/11. You saw a huge rise, a bipartisan rise in Bush's approval. And that was obviously the opposite of what occurred. And so part of it is, what is the relationship then between why have the parties sorted in terms of their relationship with knowledge-based institutions? And what does that mean for how we implement different policies at the state level, and will the states divide? And I think one of the things that also is worth watching and thinking about is, with the change in public health and the changes in the federal role in public health, you're starting to see states introduce their own public health entities, right? So I think you have one in the Northwest, you have one in the Northeast that also come together amongst Democratic states that are going to try to come up with their own vaccine schedules. And so there's the question of, why did that happen? I don't think that's a very complicated story to explain, but the long-term consequences of that are not great. Ideally, you have a federal government that provides public goods that it's efficient. It becomes pretty inefficient if you start to have different state entities providing public health rules. You're always going to have that at some level. Public health is going to go on at the state level. But on these big questions like vaccine schedules, infectious disease management, it becomes very problematic if you start to have different states acting differently, because these public health concerns don't stop at state lines. And so I'm trying to figure out exactly what's going on there and what that might look like down the road.
When you get the answer, we're going to have you back.
Yes, well.
Jamie Druckman, thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Jamie Druckman, a political science professor at U of R. Extremely interesting work that he's doing, looking into data and everything like that. And I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. So thank you, everyone, for joining us right now. In addition, we've got a U of R student and current News 8 intern in the room, Hannah Smith. If you want to give a wave to the camera up there, I don't know if they can see or not, but Hannah Smith joining us. And tell your friends and family about the Rochester First streaming app. We are daily coming out with great material. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Get the Rochester First streaming app today for everything you love from News 8 On Demand, plus exclusive shows you won't see anywhere else. Search ROC and download for free on Roku, Amazon Fire, and Apple TV.